I wonder then if I could ask Gillian Sorensen to come up to the stage. She's our moderator for the next session. Gillian comes with a formidable reputation, a career at the UN that has seen her serve several Secretary Generals as Assistant Secretary General, Special Advisor for Public Policy, and for a period, New York City Commissioner for the UN, which meant dealing with no fewer than 30,000 diplomats. Amongst many professional interests, she serves on the board of the International Rescue Committee, and I'm delighted she's with us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Gillian, over to you.
Yes, thank you, sir, and good morning, everyone. First, my thanks to all those who organized this remarkable conference. I'm very honored to be part of it and to represent today the International Rescue Committee, which has its headquarters in New York, but is present on the front lines in more than 30 countries and has been working on these issues for more than 60 years, so it has a long history. Thank you, Foreign Minister Evans, for your very comprehensive statement. It is clearly a daunting challenge for all of us who care about this. The sheer numbers, the complexity, the intractability of the refugee question and the genocide issues is really a challenge for everyone. And to find the political will, the logistical solutions, and the measure of compassion in societies who can receive refugees is also very demanding. In my own country, of course, I'm American, our country is made of refugees. If you're not an American, if you're not a Native American, everyone, whether it's two generations or 6 generations past, all of us were refugees at one point. And I'm dismayed that there is such a resistance, even a closed door to the reception of more refugees and a widespread misunderstanding of the kind of rigorous vetting they go through and the numbers that our country, a big country, could easily accommodate. We'll hope that changes. In any case, I'm very honored to chair this, to moderate this session, and after thanking Gareth Evans for his eloquent and comprehensive words, I would like to introduce our next 2 participants. And first, could I invite Arye Nair to come to the stage. Mr. Nair is president of the Open Society Foundation. He has been executive director and founder of Human Rights Watch, and he was the national director of the American Civil Liberties Union for many years. He is a refugee himself, and so he speaks with an insight and a credibility that is, gives it added depth and meaning. And then could I also invite to the stage our other speaker, Enrique Eguren. Dr. Eguren is chairman of Protection International, which provides tools and strategies to people who defend human rights and gives them ways to, in fact, defend themselves. How do we defend the defenders so that they don't lose their lives or their freedom in the process? He has been particularly active in Central and South America, but he does have activities in the Democratic Republic of Congo and Sudan and Indonesia as well. So perhaps, sir, we would begin with you. And I might ask also if you could draw lessons from Latin America that could apply to the situation in Syria and beyond.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you also to the organizers of this marvelous event. I'm very honored to be here representing Protection International and sharing some ideas with you about all this. Well, I can try to draw some experience from other places, but first I have to say that I have a point of view, because we all have a point of view. And not a political point of view, I mean because of the situation. I'm a Spanish citizen, I collaborate with an organization based in Brussels, then I'm a European citizen, let's say. So this brings me to a particular point of view about Syrian refugee crisis, but of course to the wider topic in the world. I think that we may have to look at this from different points of view, I insist. So maybe in the first place, a few bullet points, an analytical point of view. I mean, I think we are facing a growing refugee crisis in the world, but this crisis is like an assemblage, a combination at least of two main issues, let's say. Of course, there is a refugee and human rights crisis, but also there is an economic and human rights crisis from the point of economic, social, and cultural rights altogether in the world. And I think those two dimensions become intertwined in different crises. In the case of Syria, probably, and I agree with Gareth, mainly a refugee human rights crisis. People didn't want to leave the country, but they had to. They felt obliged to do it because of the situation they were living. But in other cases, like in Latin America, for example, you have this intertwining between this economic crisis and then motivation, the economic driver to migrate, together to the pressure, especially in Mexico and Central America, because of the organized crime, to flee, to look for somewhere better future. So again, coming back to the point of view of Europe, let's say, in talking about the Syrian crisis, I think, refugee crisis, I think that Europe has been most of the time a distant actor. I mean, of course, because of the foreign policy, Europe and member states also have been closely involved in all the political negotiations around the crisis, but there is a key difference here. I think for the first time since decades, I would say, European territory is affected. So there are hundreds of thousands of asylum seekers and migrants knocking at the door of Europe. So Europe's territory now is at stake. And it has caused a number of consequences that I will talk about them very briefly afterwards. Of course, there is also a legal point of view about all this. I mean, refugee law was passed years ago in a very key and also historical moment also. But now the world is different, and we need more protection, I would say, not less, but more protection. But also maybe the advances in terms of the protection of civilians, this was also mentioned before, has made it possible that now at least people try and people may flee, at least. So they are not killed on the spot, as it used to happen too often years ago. If we look briefly at the current responses from Europe, I insist, I think there is a clear thing. I mean, Europe has been dealing with the migration crisis in general from the point of view of some responsive policies. I mean, defining a restrictive policy access to Europe, trying to have ad hoc responses to the number of people knocking on the door of Europe. And I think Europe, perhaps we thought we had all the responses ready, and then the questions were changed. So we have no responses anymore. And I think that this crisis has found a very ill-prepared Europe to respond to the crisis from the point of view of Europe as a territory, I would say. And I think we keep on offering, looking for very specific ad hoc solutions, maybe responses. But I think what worries me is that the idea of Europe as an structure is cracking down under pressure, I think. And for example, we have this worrying process from my point of view of what some experts call the renationalization of migration policies. So that instead of looking for a common solution as a structure, some countries are starting to look for their own solution as a country. And this goes against the very basic idea of Europe, and I am a strong believer in the idea of Europe and rights. So I think we have a complex situation, a complex problem. I think we have to go for complex solutions. I don't think that tactical responses can honor this complex situation. And I think we need to tackle all dimensions at the same time. So again, there is no single actor in charge, of course. And then we are at a historical moment, and we have to define our position. And I finish with this, maybe saying that in order to define this position, this starting point, I think we have to honor both the political and rights approach, but also a personal approach as a citizen, let's say. I think we have maybe addressing this compassion gap the humanitarian support is talking about. And I think, again, combining this political and personal approach, we cannot think anymore of Europe as a fortress, as a castle, let's say. And if we are thinking in terms of a fortress, I would like more to draw to the idea of the Portuguese writer José Saramago, who used to talk about the stone raft. So we think that we can set sail as Europe, as a stone raft, and we can look for a new place in the world. We will find no place in the world with no refugee crisis and problem. And then I think we would have to finish, I mean, to get to the place where we have to be, exactly where we are, but opening our raft, our stone raft, to all the citizens in the world in a careful and political, smart point of view, of course. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Nair. Could we hear from you?
Yes. Well, I want to focus specifically on the Syrian refugees. And I want to address three matters. First, what could be done, or what could have been done in the first instance to help prevent this flow of Syrian refugees once the conflict was underway. And it seems to me that aside from the question of military intervention, which Gareth Evans suggests was not a serious possibility, there are other kinds of approaches that could have been possible. And to cite one example, in 1991, after the Gulf War, the Kurds in Iraq rebelled against Saddam Hussein. They thought they could take advantage of Saddam Hussein's weakness after he had been defeated in the Gulf War. It turns out they were misinformed, that Saddam Hussein retained significant military strength, and he crushed the Kurdish rebellion. And it forced more than 2 million Kurds to flee to the neighboring countries of Iran and Turkey. And the refugees were stuck there with basically no support. What was done at that time was that the coalition that had gone to war with Saddam Hussein in effect created a safe haven, a protected zone for the Kurds. And the Kurds, more than 2 million of them, repatriated to Iraq and inhabited that protected zone. And that is the origin of Iraqi Kurdistan, which has operated autonomously ever since then. Saddam Hussein made periodic efforts to enter that protected zone. Those were repulsed by the coalition, but they didn't go to war. They nevertheless managed to allow those refugees to return and to live in safety, and since then they have constructed a viable economy. Second, once the refugees leave, of course the first place they go to is the neighboring countries, and as we've heard, it is countries like Lebanon and Jordan and Turkey that play host to the largest number of the Syrian refugees. And this happens everywhere in the world. People go to the neighboring country when they fear for their lives. And one has to provide them with the assistance that they require in those neighboring countries. There are some who say that the flood of refugees to Europe was touched off particularly at a point when the World Food Program was running out of food, and a number of people felt that they had to move on in order to safeguard their lives. Aside from crises like that, there is an urgent need to provide for education for the children of the refugees. Most of the refugee children in Turkey, for example, are not in school at all, and those refugees desperately want education for their children. Assisting in providing schools for the children of the refugees, assisting in making it possible for the refugees to work in the countries in which they have taken first refuge, are crucial steps if we are to deal with the refugee crisis. And then third, once they start going onward, how does one respond? As Gillian Sorensen said, I started life as a refugee. I was an infant refugee from Nazi Germany to England. A few months before I went to England, my older sister, at the age of 10, traveled without her family to England as part of what was called the Kindertransport, in which England initially accepted some 10,000 children in order to save their lives. And then in the period right before the start of the war, and even after the war started. And this was very much debated in England at that time. The country had not recovered from the economic depression. There were large numbers of unemployed. England feared that the Germans would be sending spies and saboteurs among the refugees. Nevertheless, the humanitarian argument prevailed in England at that moment, and in a period of a few months, the British accepted far more refugees than any other country, and I was one of the beneficiaries. We arrived in England on August 16, 1939, 2 weeks before the outbreak of the war in England, and then as a refugee in England, I could not have asked for better treatment, more respectful treatment, more assistance. And I'm a lifelong Anglophile as a result of my childhood experiences in England at that time. It seems to me that Angela Merkel stands out as the figure in today's political universe who has taken a similar position to those who made it possible for me to survive, and she should be honored for playing that kind of role. There are others who have also displayed a humanitarian response, a generous response to the refugees. I think proportionately Sweden has taken the largest number of refugees. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has taken a significant number of refugees and is interested in taking more. And one of the things about the way the refugee program operates in Canada is that some of the refugees are sponsored by the government, and about 40% of them who have gone to Canada are sponsored by non-governmental organizations, church organizations, school groups, and the refugees are being treated, the Syrian refugees are being treated extremely well in Canada. The countries that exemplify the way we want to countries to respond to refugees should be honored for demonstrating what humanity means. Thank you.
Thank you both for those very interesting comments. I would like to raise a question, and I'll first direct this to Gareth Evans. When I look at the response to this truly daunting crisis, what I see is a chaotic array of answers from one country to another, from one region to another. How do we find coherence? How can we give some common bond, common binding factor so that Europe itself doesn't split apart, and so that other countries, Canada sets a high example, certainly Germany does, and not everyone can do that much, but certainly everyone could do more. What do we need to give a more coherent response?
Well, unhappily, there's no simple answer to that. If there was, we'd all be a lot happier, but everybody does tend to do their own thing, and I think the only way to get them working in a coordinated, united, coherent fashion is A, to come up with good analysis, B, to come up with good policy prescriptions that do have affordable dimensions to them, both politically affordable and fiscally affordable, because that's what governments worry about, and then find ways of putting pressure on governments to behave in a coherent fashion using such coordinating mechanisms as you have. You do have some in the United Nations, obviously, United Nations agencies. You do have some in the European Union itself. You do have some in other regional organisations, which have been particularly effective in many parts of Africa. But it's really just a matter of mobilising the analysis, clarifying the prescriptions, and then finding ways of putting the political heat on. And a lot of that political heat can come from peer group leadership in other countries that have behaved decently and who lead by example in that respect. A lot of it can also come effectively from bottom-up political pressure, because as a politician myself for 21 years, I know that one thing that always generates some kind of a reaction is the feeling that you're under siege from popular opinion in your own electorate. So the grassroots stuff does actually matter. But somehow you've got to translate that into coherent shape and bite-sized, politically acceptable proportions. And here the role of the media is fantastically important. And that's the last thing that I would emphasise, which you'll be talking about under Ted Koppel in the last session. The ability of the media to translate a sense of outrage and a sense of horror about the scale of the practical agony that's being suffered, and to put that in terms that do get communicated to mainstream policymakers can never be underestimated. We no longer talk much about the CNN effect, but believe me, the CNN effect and variations on that theme are fantastically important. So there's nothing much there that gives you an instant answer in terms of unity, coherence, cohesion, and all the rest of it. And George Soros is no doubt being wildly optimistic and coming up with the kind of proposal that he has. But nonetheless, that kind of analytical thinking, that kind of willingness to be prescriptive, and that kind of willingness to just create a voice in the media, which it is difficult for governments to ignore, is what we need.
You correctly said in your opening remarks that each crisis, each refugee crisis is distinct and different, but there are also commonalities, particularly in what leads up to that, the exclusion, the marginalization, the identification of the minorities, and so forth and so on. You've seen that happen in the past. Can you try to draw some lessons, Mr. Nair?
Well, clearly that's a critical factor. You know, among the European countries that have behaved, I think, dishonorably in dealing with the refugee crisis are a number of the East European countries, countries such as Hungary, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland. Of course, all those countries generated significant flows of refugees within living memory. That is, there were about 200,000 Hungarians who fled after the Soviets crushed the Hungarian Revolution. They were accepted by other countries, principally countries in Europe, but also in North America. They were accepted very generously, and now Hungary has stood out as a country that is hostile to the acceptance of refugees. The same happened with the Czech Republic and Slovakia after the Soviets crushed the Prague Spring in 1968. Again, they have behaved in a completely ungenerous fashion, and one of the things that they have said is they will only accept Christian refugees. So they have explicitly discriminated on religious grounds. Of course, they are citing contemporary terrorism as a rationale, and yet there really is no evidence of refugee involvement in terrorism. The terrorism that we have seen in countries like France and Belgium comes from second-generation immigrants and reflects deep problems within those countries. But the refugees are being smeared as a source of terrorism, as a way of justifying what are biased policies. And as much as one needs to honor the Angela Merkels, I think it's also important to condemn those leaders like Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, who has led the way in trying to demonize the refugees.
Would you like to speak to this? Yes.
Maybe because I failed to answer to part of the question you made before in terms of lessons learned which might be drawn from Latin America. And maybe there are two dimensions which are a bit technical, but to take on, which is maybe the numbers in the first place. I mean, numbers are different in terms of the amount of people seeking asylum in Latin America due to the wars, internal wars, civil wars in the 70s and the 80s, well, in the 90s. So numbers are different in terms of, in the case of Colombia, which is the largest crisis in the region, it's mostly about internal displacement. So it's not so much about seeking asylum outside the country. In any way, also, both Colombia and the international community is failing to answer that crisis properly. It's not only numbers, but also the pace. I mean, I think numbers are larger in this crisis, but also the people leave quickly. have been as quickly as they can, of course, talking about the several years. But in Latin America, this took maybe 5, 10, 15 years, and then being the pace difference more, it's not so difficult to look for solutions and to allow for a space in different countries. So I think those things make so different. Of course, the context and even the kind of conflict, which is mostly internal conflicts, makes it very difficult, I think, from my point of view, to draw lessons to. Instead, maybe the one I will comment on was in terms of generosity. There has been and there is a lot of generosity, both from governments but also citizens in the area, in order to accept, to offer asylum, and to respond to crises within the region, I think.
I would like to, before we run out of time, I'd like to invite questions from the audience. And if you would like to pose a question, please put up your hand. Yes, sir. Can you stand so people can hear you and tell us who you are?
Yeah. My name is Mego Terzian, Doctors Without Borders in France. What about the World Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul? Are you planning?
I'm sorry, can you speak a little louder, please? Yeah. What about?
What about World Humanitarian Summit?
Oh, the World Humanitarian Summit.
The World Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul.
Yes.
Are you planning to attend? What are your plans, for example, you, sir?
Thank you. Could you hear the question? The question relates to the World Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul very soon, and there's also a humanitarian follow-up meeting at the UN the day before the General Assembly opens in September. Any comments on that? Well, it is the meeting in Istanbul really is an effort to give some, I repeat the word, some coherence to responses to this, to learn from each other, to set some high standards, to persuade or pressure certain countries to do more. I'd like to be positive about the outcome. I think to me the most important fact is that it is happening, it's taking place, and nearly every country is coming. And this session in September will be a very important follow-up to that, with a great deal of press attention at that time because it's happening in New York and just before the opening of the General Assembly. Big meetings like that can be productive if they're well led and if they're focused. Otherwise, it can be a lot of talk that tends to disappear. But I'm optimistic. I'm hopeful for this one. Yes, please stand so we can see you.
My name is Elif Akgül. I'm coming from Istanbul. I'm a journalist working for BNet. I would like to ask you about the ongoing so-called negotiations between the European Union and Turkey in the names of the Syrian refugees and the refugee crisis. When it comes to the terms of generosity of the European culture and the position of the Turkey and the whole hosted countries, but mostly this negotiation is going on for Turkey. How do you evaluate this position that one-to-one negotiation that we send, if they send back one refugee, we are going to send back 2 more refugees, and what does it mean to you?
Could you hear the question? All right.
Well, as I said, in describing that deal, it's got its colourable dimensions, and a lot of people are feeling very uncomfortable about that particular part of it, sending everyone back from Greece, wherever they come from, whatever the credibility of their asylum seeker claims, sending them to Turkey, and then hopefully matching that by having some proper settlement program, either 1 for 1 or maybe better than that, ratio of people coming out of the existing store of people in Turkey and coming to Europe. It's not the happiest of solutions, but in terms of where we were not very many days ago, if it does have the potential to stop people taking those dangerous trips across the water, drowning at sea, if it does lead to a decent resettlement program, a fast resettlement program, and not people spending years stuck in Turkish camps, or holding camps, waiting for something to happen, which means, of course, generous resettlement quotas being accepted by many more EU countries than have so far demonstrated their willingness to do that. If those conditions can be satisfied, it's not a bad solution. In the Australian context, in dealing with the issue of people dying at sea and so on, I mean, the core answer to it was a proper regional solution with regional resettlement, regional holding operations, and a serious program of systematic resettlement with much higher quotas being taken by my country and others to clear the backlogs and enable people to move. So it's not the happiest of outcomes, but as I said, this is not an exercise for purists, it's an exercise for those of us who just want to do something, anything, to alleviate what was a totally awful situation just before. Whether even this lot will hold together remains to be seen.
Yes, ma'am. In the yellow jacket behind you there. Yes, thank you.
My name is Leila Ali Karami, and I'm a lawyer from Iran. Just recently, a few days ago, a 16-year-old boy hanged himself in a camp in Germany, a refugee boy. And the family several times asked, because they were 6 months in the camp, and they were asking for a place to be settled. I'm just wondering, Europe is not a safe place even for the refugee when they arrive. And then what we're going to do with these people, when they arrive in a safe Europe, and how we can use these kind of forums to, to attract international attention to help these people when arrive in a safe place. Thank you.
Are you?
Well, I think it's necessary to try to call attention as much as possible to episodes of that sort in order to dramatize the human cost of some of the policies that are implemented today. Overcoming the fears and the prejudices of people in an era in which, as the survey that was discussed earlier suggests, that terrorism is the issue that people are more concerned about than anything else. That's a very significant challenge. That's not a challenge that we've faced previously in trying to respond to humanitarian crises. And I don't know that anybody has a solution to that problem. But I do think that it is important to stress both humanitarian success stories and humanitarian failures, to put the human face on these stories, to make people understand the individual circumstances which produced episodes of this sort. And I think one of the things that can be said is that political leadership is all important. When a country acts in an ungenerous spirit, it is very likely because the political leaders of that country are exploiting fears for their own purposes and deriving political benefit by doing so. And when a country acts in a more generous fashion, it is often because there are political leaders who are willing to take certain risks and try to bring out the best responses from their population. And I think we have to recognize the different kinds of leadership that we have, the leadership that plays a constructive role, the leadership that plays a destructive role in addressing these issues.
Yes, sir, up there. Please stand.
Thank you so much for this very robust panel so far. Paul Mikov, Vice President for Institutional Partnerships with CMMB in New York City. To the extent to which genuine civic revolt against the regime in Syria contributed to the genesis of the crisis, there have been some recent credible commentators and analysis challenging that whole narrative. So I wondered whether, especially Garrett, you and Mr. Neer could speak to the geopolitics that sometimes seem to contribute significantly to artificial generating of crises that unfortunately sometimes lead to genocidal situations such as the one that we're faced with now in Syria.
It's a very long and complicated story untangling the roots of the current catastrophe in Syria. I mean, the beginnings of it are obviously the Arab Spring, the civil revolt against just an authoritarian leadership which was basically unarmed and non-violent, but which generated a massive overreaction from the Assad regime. Had that been responded to internationally with a massive condemnatory reaction of the kind that Gaddafi received in Libya first up when he did the same thing, killing demonstrators in the streets, I think a lot of the subsequent catastrophe might have been averted. But when you have that happen and the regime doesn't immediately crush all dissent, what happens is that you get defectors from the military, you get other people finding support from multiple international actors, all with a role to play, an axe to grind, something to pursue. And these situations do quite dramatically morph into civil war situations. And the Syrian one has been just a classic example of that. Beyond that, we can talk about the role that Russia played in propping up the regime and restoring a degree of military credibility to Assad, which he seemed in danger of losing the latter part of last year. I don't think any of that would have ultimately resulted one way or the other in an outright military victory, as I said before. I think at the end of the day, a political negotiation is going to be required. And a lot of other external actors with their fingers in this particular Syrian pie are going to have to get the hell out of there, stop imposing their own priorities and their own prejudices on the situation, and try and find enough internal players that have enough common commitment to the future of the country to craft a solution. That sounds incredibly romantic. It's not impossible, but it's still, at the moment, I'm afraid, some distance away.
If I can supplement that, you know, a number of the countries in which the Arab Spring was a significant factor were countries that were not only characterized by political repression, but by extreme corruption involving the family of the head of state. That was certainly a crucial factor in Tunisia. That was certainly a crucial factor in Egypt. And I think it was also a crucial factor in Syria, where the president's family and his wife's family have been at the center of very extreme corruption. In addition, of course, political repression in Syria involved the father Assad before it involved the son Assad. And of course, once the conflict got underway, the methods used by the Syrian government were as barbaric as anything that we know. The barrel bombs that have been a particular feature of the way in which Assad has waged warfare have caused a very extensive loss of civilian life. It is apparent that the Assad regime has particularly targeted medical facilities, and that the Syrian doctors, who have been heroes in trying to treat the victims of this conflict, have been especially targeted. And of course, Assad did use chemical weapons. So this is a regime which matches in brutality almost any that one can think of. Gareth spoke about having to sit across the table from the Khmer Rouge. I mentioned Saddam Hussein. You really have to put Assad in that category That extreme brutality is central to the disaster inflicted upon the Syrians and the consequences inflicted on many other countries as a result of this conflict.
I'd like to make one point about putting a human face on these refugees. When someone refers to 60 million refugees, people's eyes glaze over. I think it's very important to tell the personal stories, to make it live and breathe. And I was reminded through some Syrian refugees that I've met with that in this case, these are educated, skilled people. They're professionals. They don't want to be wards of the state. They want to work. They want to participate and contribute. And as a group, that should make a community that could assimilate, could add, could be a contributing factor to any society if we can find a way to connect talent with opportunity or skills with opportunity. I'm also very conscious of the enormous burden carried by Jordan, Turkey, and Lebanon. If you extrapolated those numbers to our own countries, it would be in the millions. So I think we do owe them a particular thank you on that. So let me raise one other question, and that has to do with civil society. I watch what is being done by Mercy Corps and Save the Children and Doctors Without Borders and if I can say, International Rescue Committee. Does that make a real difference? Is that meaningful? What more should be done, and how can we get coherence among the work of civil society so they don't bump into each other or compete with each other, and so that what they do adds in useful ways?
If I could just say, if you were picking the humanitarian organizations, which are especially deserving, the ones you mentioned are the ones I would put very high on my list.
All right.
Maybe it always makes me curious to understand what we mean by civil society. But I say it in a positive way because I try to be also optimistic as you try. I think civil society has a role, but the problem is how to navigate all those narratives around. I mean, some of the humanitarian organizations have a narrative about immediate response, as they have to, because they have this mandate and these skills. Some human rights organizations have a more maybe overarching or more utopist approach in terms of the full respect for human rights, but this needs to be fulfilled only because of the political will of some or most of the states who have a stake here. And at the same time, I think that most of those narratives have to do not only with the responses by the governments, but with the acceptance of responses by citizens. So at the end of the day, we come back to square number one. We have the challenge to develop this critical approach to this. And sometimes I find that we don't have enough tools. I mean, talking as a citizen, if you read the media, the newspapers, if you watch TV, you have a very partial and poor view, I would say, of the whole thing. So I think the challenge is about education, once more, basics as always, but education in the widest sense of the word. We all have some duty here to make sure that we have a critical approach to these issues, I think.
Mm-hmm. All right. Let's take one last question, right in the middle, sir. Yes.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to make a very brief comment in the context of civil society. My name is Eamon Meehan. I'm the director of Throcra. It's an Irish NGO, a member of the International Caritas Network. And I just wanted to say that in my recent experiences working with Syrian refugees, it has been very important for us to support Syrian civil society among the refugee population in Lebanon in particular. And not only Syrian civil society working to provide basic needs, food and shelter, but to sustain and to enhance Syrian culture and education and knowledge. And what they have told me is that even for children who have been out of the country for 3 or 4 or 5 years, they're already losing that sense of the culture and the history. But also things like leadership development, community development, participation is very important. So I think it's important that we recognize local civil society as a key actor as well in the humanitarian response. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, our time is up. I can't say we have resolved the Syrian crisis, but we have a lot of ideas that should provoke our thinking and our work, and I want to express my very sincere thanks to my three wonderful panelists, and thank you all for being here.
Gillian, thank you very much. I thought a very interesting panel. Before everyone jumps up for lunch, just a quick recap, actually. I was very taken by Arianaya's comments about what could be done, what could have been done in Syria, citing the protective zone in northern Iraq and Turkey that was there to protect the Kurds. You also talked about how the refugees often go to the closest countries, that share the burden, and more needs to be done there to help the refugees in countries like Jordan and Lebanon. I thought you also shared a very personal story about you finding sanctuary in England during World War II, and reflected actually, perhaps I suspect, what is the attitude of many people in this room, which is the very poor behaviour that we're seeing in Eastern Europe countries in terms of their responsibility and the way they're responding to the Syrian refugee crisis. Enrique Iguerin, I made two incredibly important points, actually, relating to Europe. First, currently a distant actor. We can't continue to think about Europe as a fortress, you said, and we do need to think more about the economic conditions that are behind these phenomenon that we're talking about. And finally, Gareth Evans and his three-point plan for a coordinated response. Good analysis, good policy prescriptions, politically and fiscally, he said, and this is as a man who was a politician for 21 years, put the political heat on our political leaders and our politicians. Finally, Gillian, thank you very much for great moderation. I think at the end, your point about actually telling the personal stories of the refugees, as you say, living and breathing human beings with lives, with talents, with skills, with opportunities, and how we can find a way of matching talent and opportunities, a point very well made, actually.